Good evening, spiritual warriors, friends of spiritual warriors, well wishes. Welcome to spiritual warriorship seminars, classes. I'm Mother Indrani, and what we do here, we're reading from the books of His Holiness Bhaktitirtha Swami, Spiritual Warrior Series. As I've said before, he has 6 spiritual warriors. And I like to say, if I continue reading and studying and trying to share with you, I could probably be here till 108, I'm not sure. But we're dealing now with today, and we're discussing from Spiritual Warrior 4, Conquering the Enemies of the Mind. But just, I'd like to give a quick reminder review, but even before that, I don't know how many of you are watching the news or have heard the news, and I was reading, preparing for class, and someone came in and told me that Michael Jackson has passed on. The expression, it could be Michael Jackson is gone. But if we realize, and we've been following the Spiritual Warriors series where Bhaktitirtha Swami keeps reminding us that we're spiritual, eternal beings. So yes, the body is there, but we say he's gone, which means that eternal part of him, which we all have, is gone. And what I do when I hear news like that, or any endeavor to just ask the Creator, of whom we're all a part of, to have him grant his soul, his eternal part, a safe journey, and he knows what is best for him. So he's now gone, but of course we all have memories who followed him from little boy, and at 50 years old he's out of that body, and we do pray for him, his soul, a wonderful journey to his next adventure. So, spiritual warriors, as spiritual warriors, we can we understand that and comprehend that we've been gaining spiritual knowledge, because it is spiritual knowledge that's needed for us to function in this world. And that's what Bhaktitirtha Swami had, his idea behind the Spiritual Warrior series. It's for us to tune into the concept of spiritual warriorship and to use it in a spiritual way, in a positive way. And he presents this concept, again, of spiritual warriorship to do what? To help us. To help us do what? To help us become grounded in understanding who we are as spiritual beings. And also to help us to cope with life in trying times. And this could be a trying time for some who may have been very attached to Michael Jackson's music and stage appearances. It can be hard when you hear. But as you gain the knowledge, you can understand and still offer very positive prayers for his soul. This presentation of spiritual warriorship is also to help us use spiritual weapons to battle the tide of depression, anxiety, and we're dealing with anger now, reading, and feelings of hopelessness that's really kind of sweeping our society. It's just not easy out there. And also to help us develop an internal positive dialogue for making the mind our friend. We did quite a bit on the mind when we did the 12 qualities of the spiritual warrior. So we have to remember that our battleground is the realm of human consciousness. And first we cleanse and purify our consciousness, and then we can help others. And as spiritual warriors, Bhakti Tirtha Swami reminds us that the path of spiritual warrior is not an easy path. It demands courage, determination, discipline, intense compassion, and unconditional love. And it requires an understanding that this world is not the final chapter. So, spiritual warriors, we're on a mission, and we're being given the techniques, technologies to move us along on that. So tonight we return excuse me, to Spiritual Warrior 4, Conquering the Enemies of the Mind. And one of those, and we've been talking on, is entitled Managing Anger. Now, we have been through quite a bit. The author opens the chapter, if you recall, with caution to us as spiritual seekers or spiritual warriors that we have to employ introspection. We have to take the time to look inside and see what's going on there that may be bringing out these qualities. Because if we don't employ introspection as we endeavor to move ahead, then we may fall back on past bad patterns. And what we're doing now is looking at them and working with them and getting them out the way. He also, in this chapter, calls upon the spiritual warriors to recognize our consciousness to be the battlefield. And our weapons are what? Genuine knowledge, integrity, compassion, and love. And we've said this many times, the weapons of the spiritual warrior. So we've discussed triggers of anger. We've discussed the 5 shoulds, the 5 blamers. And we've also talked about how to get past that. And so this book is almost like a workbook, a spiritual workbook to help us manage anger. And of course, we've been through excessive anxiety. And I'll just ask again if any of you who've been following this series have had any experiences of putting these techniques, technologies to practice in your life, and you've noticed any changes, and you care to share with us on the chat room. So tonight we're going to review, we left off the progression of anger, if I recall. And he gives us techniques to recognize the progression of anger. Because he says as anger escalates, it progresses through certain steps. Mundane anger usually manifests in an adverse chain of intense verbal expressions, gestures, and mannerisms. Now, if we see this chain of events unfolding, we may need to act with caution. Why? Because we do not want to sabotage ourselves in this negativity. You can understand that. And this anger, we see it expressed, I'm sure, almost every day. And then he says, if we act with caution and don't submerge ourselves in this negativity, then we can try to help the other person avoid this intensity. We used to use an expression when it came to maybe anger and talking to people, they used to say it takes two to tango. And so for anger to build up to that, escalate to that, it takes two. But if one is working on oneself, as we've mentioned, and are hearing these techniques, technologies, and are endeavoring to advance spiritually, then we can help that other person. He says, if we completely lose control of the anger, we may act so destructively within a relationship that it will later require more time, energy, and resources to rectify the problem and rebuild the relationship. But he says we can avoid all this trouble simply by honoring and addressing the situation properly from the very beginning. Then we will feel happier in our lives and have the ability to give more value to others. Are you picking up on this throughout this? It's about helping others, valuing others, but we must first cleanse, purify ourselves, and work on ourselves. He says, we will develop spirituality in a very dynamic way. That's when we have the ability to give more value to others. So he's giving us the following techniques to help us recognize anger when it begins to escalate. Now, I don't know, for some reason I think I did these last week, but with these techniques you can do it week after week after week until you imbibe it and begin to practice it and see change in your life. Techniques to recognize the progression of anger. 1. Check the habit of mind reading. His commentary, mind reading happens, you know what happens when you, oh, I know what you do, da 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 da. And it's really, do you really? But it happens when one person speculates about the thoughts of another person, accepts the speculation as true, not what the other person has said or doing, your own speculation in your mind, and then you act on the speculation. Sounds familiar? He then says we can stop this by taking more time to understand the person's real intentions and concerns. 2. Implement time out in negative situations. For instance, if a situation simply turns into a combative conflict, we could say, maybe we should finish this conversation tomorrow or this evening. Now, if you're not trying to read the other mind and you're really endeavoring, as he's told us so many places, of how to help others, you can be able to do that because you can catch yourself. So by saying that, in this way we will have a greater chance to address the conflict in a rational way and to access a loving connection rather than an unhealthy emotional way. And many of you with children, you use that time out, don't you? When they're going off on something and You're trying to get through to them and they're not paying any attention, and you finally stop. Okay, now time out. And you put them somewhere and just tell them to be quiet for a while. So that even gives them a chance, depending on age. Or even the youngest one, they know when they've done something wrong. I think a lot of times they're just trying us to see how far they can go. But we must be careful. He tells us here that this technique can help some of you deal with your children. If the behavior leads you to feel irrational anger, it might help to punish them at a later time, when you can address the behavior in a more rational manner. You let them know that you disapprove of their actions, but you give them the chastisement at a time when you have more control over your anger. In this way, the chastisement will proportionately correspond to the issue, so that it will bring rectification instead of an assault or devastation. 3, monitor our self-talk. Self-talk refers to the positive or negative things that we tell ourselves. And for the average person, studies indicate that the majority of thoughts are negative. Have you ever sometimes just stop and watch the thoughts that's going through your mind? Ooh! But once you learn mastery of the mind, as we back to those 12 qualities, the first quality, you can stop it as you see it and change that around, change the tape. He says many people focus solely on their weaknesses and the reasons for such weaknesses. They meditate on the people who anger them and the reasons for their anger. The list goes on and on. For this reason, it is very important to acknowledge the power of the mind, which can be our greatest enemy. If we do not check such negativity, these harmful messages will control us. So that's what I'm saying. Be constantly aware and watch where that mind is going and what kind of talk you're doing because of the nonsense it's bringing out. Number 4, he says, write verses or notes on a set of cards that we can access in urgent situations. In this way, when we find ourselves overwhelmed by our emotions, we can try to review one of the cards describing the proper way to act in a certain situation. You can do that just with these points that I'm bringing out, have been reading here, the techniques to recognize. Or probably you could have done them with, what else did we go over the other day? We had 9 positive ways to deal with shoulds and blaming. If you had taken these down and just the heading, the commentary would come to you, or you would have an example of it in your head, and you keep it on you, especially if you know you're one who has a tendency to lose your temper quickly. But you can feel it coming, and the mind starts talking its nonsense. You pull out your cards and you read. Check that habit of mind reading. I can't read their mind, huh? Or you decide, oh, maybe this is time for a timeout. Okay, Prabhu, okay, my dear. Let's talk about this later. I'm going to go out for a breath of air. You see? So you keep those cards, because when that rush comes, sometimes you forget to use good intelligence. But you'll remember, oh, let me see if we can stop this. So I think this is a wonderful, wonderful part. He says we can record many different prayers or spiritual perspective to help us under all types of circumstances. And if you're reading your scripture, sometimes you're just reading a very positive book, and there'll be a line that says, think of God first, or always remember God, or stop. You write it on a card and keep those cards handy. The next one, number 5, he states, practice proper behavior through visualization. Have you heard that before? Sure, you've heard about visualization. He says, for example, if you have a problematic relationship, you can visualize your next interaction with the person and visualize a positive response to their behavior. Again, you are responsible for what's going on in your mind, the pictures you're bringing, the self-talk you're doing, and that means you can switch and change if it's a negative situation. You can even see that person behaving positively or responding to you differently. He says, in this way, you can try to change past patterns that have negated the love factor and resulted in anger. You will bring with you a great sense of strength and clarity when you move into the person's physical presence. Athletes as well as expert businessmen practice this technique. They already have a vision of the future in the present. Therefore, the present turns into an organized and controlled reality, since their minds have already embraced the proper course of action. This is really, really important. I'm having a flashback many, many, many years ago. But in my marriage, I was studying, Science of the Mind, it was called at that time, and during that 60s time, there was a lot of metaphysics, and they used to call it New Age, but a part of it had to do with visualization. And I don't remember fully the story, but the flashback I'm having, there was a way I wanted my husband to behave or speak or something in the house, and I decided to use visualization. Because it was, I didn't want to say it was sort of a shaky time in the marriage. And I began visualizing him smiling nicely and probably agreeing to what I wanted, or just being very pleasant. And I went on about my business with this visualization. One day, at some point, I remember saying something, and he turned and he smiled and he spoke nicely, and I was like, oh my God. And for the next few days, I couldn't believe it. He was just as nice as could be. And what I realized was, with him being nice, I couldn't find fault and blame him for what was going on I didn't like in the marriage. But it works. You must try it. You must try it. Okay, number 6. Practice rehearsing our behaviors in the mirror or with another person. Whoa. How about that? When you go into that and you start grimacing and rolling your eyes and look in the mirror. Oh my gosh. But also, if you practice rehearsing how you want the other person to respond to you, you will change that and make it, look, see yourself. He says, in this way we will have more control of ourselves and bring forth more love. If you could look at yourself in a loving way and realize that other face, that's not me. I don't want to be like that. And realize who you really are. And that, as we had in Spiritual Warrior 2, School of Love, the soul is made for love. You're a spirit soul. You see how all of this fits if you've been listening and following or reading. Again, I remind you, these books are available at Krishna.com, and it'd be wonderful to follow along or to read on your own and then put them into wonderful practice to share with others. Number 7, try to channel the negative energy, because lust is ultimately misdirected love. And we went through that when we read What is Lust in Spiritual Warrior 2. His commentary. I'll read that again. Try to channel the negative energy, because lust is ultimately misdirected love. He says, we do not just want to repress or deny the energy, but we can try to channel it into constructive, creative, and healthy engagements. Sometimes the greatest creations have come out of anxieties. Some of the greatest prayers, meditation, poems, or literatures have developed from that energy, which the person then channels into a productive expression. I think it's in one of his books, but I know I've read sometimes, rather than go at the person, you sit and write. You write a letter to that person, or you write some expression of what's going on and what you would like to say or want that person to say to you. So you're using that energy in a creative way. And number 8. Now, what of these we've been calling out? What have we been going through? They're techniques, right? What kind of techniques? Test time. These are techniques to recognize the progression of anger. And number 8, negotiate and explain need in a palatable way, so that all sides can genuinely communicate and develop appreciation. Now let's see what his commentary is. Think on that. To negotiate and explain need in a palatable way, so that all sides can genuinely communicate and develop appreciation. He says it will also help us to become more aware of the science of mediation and conflict resolution. This will definitely help a person to understand and control their own as well as others' anger. He goes on now about the effects of anger. First is physical problems. Anger has many consequences, including physiological effects. For instance, researchers involved law students in a study that lasted over a period of 25 years. Out of 118 attorneys who had taken the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory 25 years earlier as law students, those who had scored in the upper quadrille on the hostility scale were 4.2 times more likely to die prematurely. In another study, researchers also recognized that the more hostile type A person might have greater rates of heart disease due to frequent and potentially damaging hormones released during the fight or flight response. This basically means we are more likely to have a premature death. From this study, this basically means that people who suffer from excessive anger and aggression are more likely to have a premature death. From this study, we can see the effects on one's physical existence. We also know that anger leads to hypertension, ulcers, hardening of the arteries, along with many other ailments. Then there's social disturbances, From a sociological perspective, people gradually begin to avoid a person who constantly exhibits anger. And I'm sure many of you may have been in those situations, and somebody that's constantly yelling, screaming, blaming. If you see them coming, you try to get out the way. So I hope none of that's happening to you. And if you do have an anger problem, which we've been told here we need to look at, that could be a way to know that you need to do some work on yourself if you see people getting out the way when you're coming. Now he says, even if such a person has something of value to share, others will be less likely to accept it due to their fury. It will hinder their ability to communicate with others and express their particular needs. However, an angry person may sometimes even get what they want just because other people will react to their anger to pacify them. In one sense, anger is a sign of need. But if it is expressed with violence or with unhealthy words, it can cause the opposite effect. It may cause others to shut down rather than to reciprocate or assist. If we deeply look at our own anger, we will see that it often creates the opposite of what we really want. Are there any questions or comments up to this point?
A devotee by the name of Madan Mohan just joined, and he's just very thankful for hearing what you're sharing today.
Welcome, Madan Mohan. Welcome. The next section is called Spiritual Weaknesses and Offenses. Now he goes on Unfortunately, the spiritual course of anger are even higher. And remember, we're studying spiritual warriorship. Through all of these books, we've been reminded of who we are as spiritual beings, who God is in our lives, our relationship with Him, how He's always there for us, who's the controller, and how to follow the techniques, technologies in order to get closer to Him. So He's saying if you're on that path, it costs you spiritually. He says it can anger with her. It can lead to all types of offenses, such as offenses to devotees, the holy name, the holy places of pilgrimages, as well as the spiritual master or mentor. Not only can anger cause us to offend the devotees and the spiritual master, but it can also cause us to execute our services in a ridiculous way. Anger is comparable to spiritual suicide. So it's very important, those of us, those of you on the spiritual path, you have a teacher or mentor, you're doing service, to be very mindful and alert about anger expressing through you. Because, as he says, it's comparable to spiritual suicide, and you don't want that. He goes on, he says, in the 4th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, Daksha, one of the demigods, exhibits irrational and misplaced anger, which cannot be checked even by good advice and encouragement. The anger completely bewilders his intelligence. If we fall prey to this unhealthy aspect of anger, we will lose our clarity of vision and our proper perspective, which can devastate us spiritually. You see, he's stressing the importance of being strong and clear and intelligent in your spirituality. And he's telling us what this anger can do. And here he tells us from Srimad Bhagavatam 4:19 about Daksha, who actually curses Lord Shiva due to anger. It says, Maitreya said, continue, my dear Vidura, in spite of the requests of all the members of the sacrificial assembly, Daksha, in great anger, cursed Lord Shiva, and then left the assembly and went back home. Now, Srila Prabhupada, I'm wearing a Srila Prabhupada shirt tonight. I hope you devotees have noticed. Srila Prabhupada writes in his purports. Now, let's listen to what Srila Prabhupada has to say. Anger is so detrimental that even a great personality like Daksha, out of anger, left the arena where Brahma was presiding and all the great sages and pious and saintly persons were assembled. All of them requested him not to leave, but infuriated, he left, thinking that the auspicious place was not fit for him. Prabhupada continues, puffed up by his exalted position, he thought that no one was greater than he in argument. It appears that all the members of the assembly, including Lord Brahma, requested him not to be angry, and leave their company. But in spite of all these requests, he left. That is the effect of cruel anger. In Bhagavad Gita, therefore, it is advised that one who desires to make tangible advancement in spiritual consciousness must avoid these three things: lust, anger, and the mode of passion. Again, we're being reminded that we want to advance in spiritual consciousness, and we're being given techniques here and the knowledge here of how to be able to do that. Srila Prabhupada continues, actually, we can see that lust, anger, and passion make a man crazy, even though he be as great as Daksha. The very name Daksha suggests that he was expert in all material activities. But still, because of his aversion towards such a saintly personality as Shiva, he was attacked by these three enemies: anger, lust, and passion. Lord Chaitanya, therefore, advised that one be very careful not to offend Vaishnavas. He compared offenses toward a Vaishnava to a mad elephant. As a mad elephant can do anything horrible, so when a person offends a Vaishnava, he can perform any abominable action. So here we're being warned again. Offensive, being insulting a Vaishnava, another spiritual being. And really that means everybody, because we're all spiritual beings. So we're being told many things here to help us on our spiritual path. Bhakti Tirtha Swami continues, the Bhagavad Gita tells us that attachment leads to illusion, and then to bewilderment and fall down. In this case, many great sages and rishis tried to instruct Daksha, but his anger had bewildered his intelligence to such an extent that he could not recognize his own improper behavior or hear from others. We must avoid these negative tendencies if we want to make advancement spiritually. It is not optional. Anytime we see excessive lust or anger emerging in our consciousness, we should recognize it as a warning. Again, we are responsible. We must be accountable for ourselves and our action. Are you getting that? This he brings out through every book we've been through so far, and techniques and technologies. And it's just as we went through some of the problems of blamers. We can't blame others. We must look at ourselves. We must do introspection, as he's told us. And we must constantly be mindful of what's going on in our minds, our self-talk, as we mentioned before. We have to recognize the warning, he says. If we see excessive lust or anger emerging in our consciousness, it will disturb our ability to enter into the divine relationship in the spiritual kingdom under the service of the divine couple or Mother, Father, God. He continues, lust, anger, and passion make people crazy. And in devotional circles as well as in material circles. People can act in horrible ways due to anger, although they will usually regret such abominable action later. Often people will hurt their closest associates instead of giving them love. In this case, Daksha should have had great love and appreciation for his son-in-law, Lord Shiva, along with all the other great personalities such as Lord Brahma. However, due to his intense irritation, he could not hear any rational instructions from the great assembly of sages who in unison attempted to instruct him. And those of us who've been out there in the material world working or socializing, and we're coming to spiritual life, we're in spirit, this scene may sound familiar. How many times have you been to a wedding reception or a party or a social gathering, and somebody says something, does, and one person just goes off, and everybody is saying, don't do that, you shouldn't, and usually it ends up pretty bad, sometimes even having to call the police. But we are spiritual warriors. We're on the path of spiritual warriorship. And it takes courage. It's not easy. But we're being given tools and technologies to work with these things. He goes on. The next section is conceals the cause of the pain. Anger can cause us to hide or conceal our pain if we use it as a defense mechanism. Sometimes the expression of anger may manifest from loneliness, fear, guilt, hurt, or even pride. Although these feelings may externally appear as anger, we will find a much deeper cause. Pride especially has adverse effects. He states, if yogis and pandits or scholars lack sufficient devotion in spite of their austerities and penances, instead of developing love and compassion and penances, they will simply develop knowledge, power, and even anger. This is a very subtle aspect of anger that sometimes manifests among great yogis who might even curse each other. Daksha's behavior exhibits this negative reaction. First, he cursed Lord Shiva, and Nandisvara, one of Shiva's principal associates, later cursed all the supporters of Daksha. Finally, the sage Brigu condemned all of the followers of Lord Shiva with another very strong curse. What do you call that? The domino effect. The situation turned into a complete mess. All of these Brahmins had power and Shakti, but due to the lack of Bhakti, in some cases, the illusion covered over their knowledge. And one more point here. Creates irrational responses to situations. He goes on, anger may also disturb us by causing a situation to affect us on a much larger scale than necessary. For instance, if someone's actions or words disturb us, we may now allow a cloud to cover the way in which we see and deal with that person. Repressed anger can also lead to irrational reflections, which cause us to act accordingly or hinder our ability to function properly. Sometimes we might even have a genuine reason to feel anger, but instead of giving it an excessive amount of attention, we can try to separate the activity from the person. We hear, hate the sin, but not the sinner. Although a person may sin, we should always have a certain level of appreciation and affection for him or her. My guru, Bhaktitirtha Swami, used to say, Krishna is in everything. And there were times he would tell us, no matter what that person, look for the good in that person. And sometimes that takes a lot of effort, but if you're focusing on that, it will cool down some of whatever you may think that action needs for you to get angry. He says, when a genuine issue disturbs us, we can still feel uncomfortable about the activity without attaching a label too directly onto the person. He says, we do not want to incorporate our anger about a specific negative action into all of our interactions with the person. You understand that? Yes, at this moment, that person did an action that's negative. But all along, that person has been all right. So you don't want to take that one action at that time, that one negative action, into all your interactions with that person. You may want to deal with that one action and not bring it into everything. He says such a mindset is unhealthy. Even if it just lasts for a moment. We do not have to turn the incident into a protracted issue. If another person has acted in a displeasing way, as caring individuals, remember we're spiritual warriors now, as caring individuals, we still have the responsibility to respond with integrity, thoughtfulness, and compassion. However, if that response involves labeling the individual rather than taking a thoughtful action, it takes away from unconditional love. It takes away our ability to serve as a genuine caretaker and help the other person. I wish I'd been marking how many times he keeps reminding us that our action, and we have to have the qualities of our action to help the other person, and to help the other person will love. I'm going to end there because the next section is called anger management, and that's going to be really exciting as he goes into first one being counteracting negativity, but that's next week. Are there any comments, any questions? Anybody used any of the techniques, technologies we've been reading and sharing with you over the past few weeks through anxiety, excessive anxiety, or now we're learning how to manage anger and look at ourselves? Any comments, any questions before we leave you?
Someone wants to know where to get the book, and I'm going to...
Okay, where to get the book. Krishna.com. Spiritual Warrior 4, Conquering the Enemies of the Mind. And we've got quite a ways to go yet. But I hope that it's helpful to those of you who are out there and are listening, and if you have any anger issues or see anybody with, that these techniques and technologies will help you. So you've got a lot to work on this week, and hopefully you will, and have a wonderful week, and we look forward to meeting and greeting you next week, where we will be dealing with anger management. First section, counteracting negativity. Hare Krishna.